Hi again, everyone. This is Dr. R. We're covering another question on the scientific method. So once again, lead in. Which step of the scientific method does the researcher study represent? So scientific method, and then here are the examples of different components of the scientific method. Now, there's not a full agreement on whether there's 5, 6, or 7 steps. But what I know by looking at this is that these are describing some of the steps that are in the scientific method. So really quickly, let's review some of these steps, remembering that they're not fully agreed upon in the order that they are, but here are the ones that I would like to talk about. Number one, we often start with a problem, or we have questions about something that we've been actually observing, and this often comes from us either having a curiosity or an interest or observing something that's actually happening in the community that we're in. Then we might actually go into the research question or come up with a question based on what we had observed before, and the research question actually might come from that observation, or we might actually just research the problem itself and then come up with a research question. Then from that research question, we will then start to develop an actual statement, which is not a research question, and that statement will include a hypothesis, and we will form a null and an alternative hypothesis that is testable. So how we design and state our hypotheses need to be testable, because our next step would be the experiment itself. How do we design the experiment or the study? And then to make sure that this experiment or study is collecting the data that is going to be testable for the hypothesis. So our next one is the data analysis, which in my mind also includes data collection as well as the analysis. Do we have the correct data for the testable, alternative, and null hypothesis that we're actually trying to test? Okay, from there we then go into conclusions. So what are the results and the limitations or the implications of the study? This is where we're going to be talking about the results and the discussion. And then we want to make sure that we communicate or iterate. We want to inform the scientific community about what we have found. We also want to think about how we can create new hypotheses related to this. So these are the steps that I have, and now let's go back to the question. We have analysis, data collection, experimentation, a hypothesis testing, and observation. So we just talked about all of these. This says a graduate researcher is interested in studying the effects of caffeine on memory. So the effects of caffeine on memory. He hypothesizes, so he does create a hypothesis that caffeine will improve memory performance. So is that actually H naught, the null hypothesis, or is that HA? To me, that is here, that lives in HA, because make an assumption that it will improve, right? H naught would be that there is no difference. And as HA is that caffeine equals increased memory. So he's talking about HA here. To test his hypothesis, the graduate researcher recruits 100 participants and randomly assigns them to either a caffeine group or a placebo group, right? So either a caffeine group or a placebo group. So one of the things this guy's going to have to do, this graduate researcher, is definitely have to go get IRB. We don't want to give any drug, i.e. caffeine is a drug. We don't want to expose anybody to any harm, so we're going to have to make sure that this study's been proven to pass IRB. He then asks them to complete a memory task and records their scores. So they do a memory task and then collect the scores on the memory task. Which step of the scientific method does the researcher's study represent? Remember, we're looking for the most correct not the correct, right? And so what that means is that some of these might actually be correct, but there's one that's more correct than the others. So in analysis, I'm going to say that this is not really covering an analysis portion because it only records the scores. It doesn't say what it's actually doing with them. Data collection, it does talk about recording their scores of the memory task, but it also talks about random assignment. It talks about an alternative hypothesis. It's much more than just data collection. Experimentation, is this talking about how it designs the study? It does. In my mind, it's talking about how it actually designs the study because it says that we have two groups, the randomly assigned. It's talking about some of the data that we're going to be collecting. So I'm going to kind of keep that one there for right now. Hypothesis testing. It is talking about a hypothesis. Is it testing this hypothesis? Well, one could argue that it actually is trying to test this hypothesis, right? That it's trying to test HA when we should really only be testing H naught. Because if we actually look for data with no difference, then we're actually keeping honest people honest. That's why we actually test for no difference and we don't try to test for HA. So we're pleasantly surprised when HA is accepted. So I agree, hypothesis testing is on the table here. What about observation? This doesn't really seem to fit steps 1 and 2 about an observation. It seems like they already had that information in their head and they wanted to move forward. So I'm going to say that that one's out. But out of both of these, hypothesis testing, I think, is definitely on the correct route. But I think this entire thing really looks at the entire experiment more than just the hypothesis testing component. So in my mind, the most correct is experimentation.